I'm going to talk about another thing that has come out of B4. And so Maggie introduced the B4 project at the start. And one of the things that happened quite early on was that Nick Benton-Green, who sadly isn't here today, thought that the Scilly Isles would be a really interesting place to look for dark bees. And then shortly afterwards, Ginny Halliday here moved to the Scilly Isles and really sort of got things going. And then Stephen Fleming, who's in the audience there, who's one of the editors of Beecraft, got really interested in movement of bees between the islands, and that led to the Game of Drones project, which has been described in Beecraft and has produced some really interesting results. And there's a paper submitted to the Journal of Agricultural Research which needs revision, but will hopefully get published when we get round to finishing it. So I'm today going to talk about biosecurity, and this is the outcome of something I was asked to put together by an organisation called Small is Beautiful, which is a company set up by the Duchy of Cornwall, who own the Scilly Isles, as part of a much larger landscape recovery project, which is looking at the problems of islands, invasive plants, rats, things like that, and so on, of which bees are a small part. And so we wanted to look at the biosecurity of all pollinators. So islands are actually really interesting places. They often have a limited flora and fauna, usually a subset of those species that are on the mainland nearby. Sometimes they have other things that are not present on the mainland. And as Charles Darwin found out a long time ago, islands often have a really interesting fauna because you have unique local variants that have evolved on those islands. But he also pointed out, and we know, that island populations are inherently vulnerable to invasive species and local extinctions. But islands are particularly interesting because they're microcosms of much larger ecosystems and areas, and they're easier to study than trying to study the whole of Australia or whatever. If you go to a small island, you can see what's going on. So I'm sure you're all very familiar with the Isles of Scilly off the southwest tip of Cornwall. 5 inhabited islands, and however many uninhabited islands there are, depending on the time of day. And yes, they do have an interesting collection of pollinators. So they have 1 honeybee, which I shall come on to. They have 6 bumblebee species. So we have 20-something on mainland Britain, and 2 of the most common British bumblebees are not present on Scilly. So there's this thing called the Scilly bee, which is Bombus muscorum scilionus, which was a unique colour variant of the moss carder bumblebee, which is pretty rare anyway in many parts of Britain. But sadly, it's not been seen since 2012, despite lots of very diligent surveying, and sadly is probably now extinct, emphasising the point I made at the beginning. There are 37 solitary bee species thought to be established, and there is an interesting one that is okay. So the buffish mining bee, the Scilly version, is a unique colour variant that's shared with the Channel Islands and is slightly more brightly coloured. As well as that, the bee fauna is actually quite well described and studied. Some of the other pollinators are less well described. So, according to the Collins New Naturalist book of the Scilly Isles, the 2 most common social wasps, the German wasp and the common wasp that we have here, are not established on Scilly, although have turned up from time to time. But the tree wasp, Dolicha vespula sylvestris, which is not that common on the mainland, is pretty common. And you send me that picture, I'll have a look and see what it is. So there are a number of solitary wasps. So you've got hunting wasps, digger wasps, ruby-tailed wasps. Not a huge number of species of butterflies and moths, but some of the Scilly versions are colour variants of mainland species. Various migrant butterflies, so you get things like monarch butterflies turning up occasionally all the way from the United States. Not many records of hoverflies, but certainly things like the marmalade hoverfly, which are migrants in mainland Britain, turn up quite commonly. So this insect fauna demonstrates that there are pathways for the movement of insects from the mainland or further abroad already existing. So some of these new arrivals may be really interesting scientifically, but some of them may be undesirable, and those can use those same pathways to get there. So beekeeping, we don't know how long honeybees have been there. They may well have been there since the end of the last ice age, when the Scilly Isles were joined to, well, first of all, they were one big island, and then they were joined to mainland Cornwall, if you go back even further. Tresco Abbey, the medieval monks there would have almost certainly kept honeybees. But unfortunately, we know that buckfast bees have been brought to the island in recent years because the beekeepers were concerned that there would be inbreeding. However, most of the beekeepers now, I think, are fairly convinced that importing is a bad idea. And we currently believe the islands don't have the varroa mite. So this is a slide that is a few years old, that was in Beecraft originally, and it's got known managed hives 45. I know a few have died over the winter, but it's of that order. So not a lot of managed colonies. For Ollie's benefit, we know of a number of free-living colonies in walls and trees and things, and from the number of swarms that we saw a couple of years ago when we were there on one evening, I suspect there were a lot more free-living colonies than we know about. So what are these honeybees? As I say, Nick was originally interested in, was this a refuge of dark bees? So again, this was some work done in 2022. Samples were collected and sent to Bee Bites in Edinburgh and published in Beecraft. And along with the studies that I mentioned and John mentioned earlier, what we're looking at here is the C lineage in yellow, which is the Carniolan and Italian bees. The black is the M lineage, the Apis mellifera mellifera, and the blue is O. So you actually find that in buckfast bees. So of these islands, the two here, Tresco and Briar, there was quite a lot of black in them. St Agnes, which is the one that's had the buckfast bees, are mainly C and a little bit of blue there. And then St Mary's and St Martin's are a bit of a mixture, because the beekeeper here has helpfully given nukes to the beekeepers on these two islands. So that was for 2022 samples, but as I said this morning, I also got some samples from Tresco and Briar as part of the Better Bee sampling I talked about. So the Tresco ones, by mitochondrial DNA, they came out as M lineage, and this M17A hash slash haplotype. But nuclear DNA, they came out as 89% AMM with a bit of Iberiensis and a bit of Ligustica and Carnica. The samples from Briar came out as C lineage by mitochondrial DNA, but by the nuclear DNA, they also came out very similar in terms. So, this is the maternal line. This is showing the sort of mixture of, the combination of the drones and the queens. So just from two islands, but yes, there are some, relatively interesting bees here. And this haplotype here, so there were bees brought from Colonsay to the Scilly Isles some years ago. This is not the same as the Colonsay ones. So that was quite an interesting result. So what I was supposed to do was look at what pests and diseases are there already and what ones we don't think are there and how to keep those out. So what pests and diseases are present on Scilly? There's not a lot of literature. as you would imagine. Some whole genome sequencing that was done by bee-bites has shown a few things. This was Lena Welfurt's group at Exeter University took some samples a few years ago because they were interested in the differences between pathogens of bumblebees and honeybees on islands and mainland populations. So some of these are really obscure things that I had to look up and see what on earth they are. These are bumblebee viruses, but there are two things that are interesting here. This is deformed wing virus B, and I shall mention in a minute that I haven't seen deformed wing virus symptoms there, but deformed wing virus B is the variant of deformed wing virus that is associated with the varroa mite. So the background population was the A variant, which with varroa has been replaced by the B variant. And deformed wing virus B was only described in 2001, so it can't have been there very long. And then the other one is Nosema cerani, gut parasite. And Nosema cerani was only described in 1996 and was only found in the UK in 2007. So those two, I suspect strongly, have come in recent years in queen imports, and these bees have been in contact with varroa. It's really difficult to think of any other possible explanation for how those two got there. So I had a chat with the beekeeper who imported bees quite recently, and he said, I got the queen cages and I looked at them very diligently under the microscope and I didn't see any varroa mites on them, but unfortunately you can't see viruses, so I think, hang on. And the other one, of course, is the yellow-legged Asian hornet, which I shall come on to in a minute, which hopefully isn't there anymore, but we'll find it. So there are lots of things that, the list of possible bee diseases gets longer and longer every year as people find new and possibly unexciting viruses. So there are lots of things that aren't there. Many of those things are not present in Britain, but there are other things that are common in Britain that don't appear to be on Scilly, but we don't really know. But I want to pick out European and American foul brood. I find it very hard to believe it's never been on the Scilly Isles, but the beekeepers don't seem to think it's there now. And the varroa mite. And certainly, I'll come on to that in a second. And then at the bottom, we've got the exotic ones that we really don't want, the small hive beetle and Tropulolaps that I mentioned before, which we're worried about in the whole of Britain, but Scillies are uniquely vulnerable. So, are the islands varroa free? Well, I, over a couple of visits, looked at as many hives as I had time to on all 5 islands now. And so I inspected about half of the managed colonies, which you could do on an island because it's quite small. I saw no signs of varroa or deformed wing virus symptoms. I saw no signs of foul brood, but I didn't do a full foul brood inspection. But in science, we tend to say that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The fact that we haven't seen it doesn't mean it's not there. And in order to get some kind of protection on the islands, we really need to prove that something isn't there. And that's really difficult to do. So what we do is to do our best. And the first thing is that APHA, the National Bee Unit, have agreed to maintain a sentinel hive on each island. And the Duchy of Cornwall kindly provided some new hives. And so there is now a sentinel hive on each island. And this is joined the network of sentinel hives that are around the country looking for exotic pests. And there are standard protocols and samples are sent to the National Bee Unit. This one obviously does have lots of varroa mites, but hopefully the samples from the Scillies won't have. A program of bee sampling. So those few papers I put up there were studies that were done for some other reason. There's been no systematic disease study. So what we want to do is to look at bees in a fairly systematic way and look for all the pests and pathogens that might be there. So we've collected, or Scilly has collected samples, and there are logistical problems of being on islands. You have to collect them, you then have to get them from, you have to travel between the islands at the right time of day when the tides allow. You then have to take them to the one post office, and then this is Mark Barnett up in Edinburgh of Bee Bites, the samples being collected. So the plan is, most of the things on that list are DNA-based organisms, so whole genome sequencing will find those, and as I say, the earlier samples done by Bee Bites found Nosema ceranae in them. Unfortunately, many of the viruses are RNA-based, and you need to do a different analysis. And in fact, Mark rang me up on Thursday night to say that unfortunately the samples that were sent for RNA, when they extracted the RNA, it was all degraded. So we have to think again on how to collect samples. It may well be sending live bees up to Edinburgh, which will be interesting. But that should hopefully fill in the picture a bit on what pests and pathogens are present. And then after many years of asking, a bee inspector will actually visit during 2026 and go through every hive and do a proper foul brood inspection and so on. So these things may pick up diseases that at present we didn't know about. You never reach a point where you could absolutely guarantee that something isn't there, but in an island you probably have a fairly good degree of certainty. Somebody mentioned about the relationship between different pollinators, and yes, the landscape recovery scheme is very interested in the interactions between managed honeybees and the other pollinators there. Competition is one factor. Do pathogens of honeybees affect other pollinators? Well, yes, absolutely they can. This is a review paper done by Orlando Yeneth and colleagues from the Kolos virus group a few years ago. And this is looking at the interactions between, this is a flower, interactions between different organisms that visit flowers. So here you have your social bees. These are bumblebees here, and these are honeybees here. They're visiting the flowers. They interact with each other. You can have vectors like varroa mites moving things around. Honeybees can rob bumblebees. Bumblebees can rob honeybees. There are social parasites of bumblebees. Bumblebees can drift between colonies. Honeybees drift between colonies. Over here, you've got the non-social bees, the solitary bees, some of which nest communally and spread diseases and pests between them. Some of them live in holes in the ground communally and spread things between them. You then have hoverflies, and you then have wasps, which visit flowers but also prey on other bees. And you can see that there is a huge possibility for some of these things to move around between organisms. Fortunately, several of the key organisms, viruses, that have been the particular focus of studies between interactions between bumblebees and honeybees don't appear to exist on the Scilly Isles at present. So, pathways for entry. You need to think, well, how do they get in? So, for pathogens such as Varroa, AFB and EFB, which are present on the mainland around here, hopefully not AFB and EFB at the moment, but they certainly have been. It's obviously colonies or queens from the mainland and used beekeeping equipment. So a used hive that's, American foul brood spores can survive for 50 years on old equipment or whatever. So this is a good one to avoid. So to prevent that, you obviously ban imports of colonies or queens and used beekeeping equipment. For exotic pests, such as the small hive beetle and tropulalates that we don't yet have in mainland Britain, it's queens imported from elsewhere, as I mentioned this morning. And to prevent those, you ban imports from elsewhere. So how do you ban it? You can have a voluntary ban, and the islands are so small and there's so few beekeepers that I think there is currently a lot of support for the idea of voluntary ban, but that doesn't prevent somebody who doesn't know about it moving to the island and bringing some bees with them. Or there's the possibility of a legal ban. And there has been a little bit of history. So Colonsay has been mentioned a few times, and Andrew Abrahams eventually secured legislation that means that it is now illegal to keep any bee other than the native dark European honeybee on Colonsay and Oronsay. And I'm going up to Colonsay in a few weeks' time, and I shall talk to him about that. But that was a very long and tortuous process using part of the Wildlife and Countryside Act that was originally designed to protect red deer populations, I think. And then the Isle of Man has protection under EU legislation. The Isle of Man was never a member of the EU, but when we were, it was able to use that, and it's actually strengthened it. So it's not only illegal to import bees to the Isle of Man, it's now illegal to import used beekeeping equipment, unprocessed hive products and so on. And then, of course, across the water in the Republic of Ireland, the Native Irish Honeybee Society have been promoting this native honeybee bill, which is going through Parliament, and John and I and various other people were involved in supplying evidence to that, and we don't know where that's going to go. It may be that the Scilly Isles, because they all belong to one body and have one council that is in charge of the whole thing, that there is some local bylaw legislation that might be possible. So that's clearly got to be looked at. And it's a big but, there's lots of things coming into the island. So there are lots of ships and boats of all sizes, ferries, cruise ships, little boats, pleasure boats, and swarms can certainly travel around on those. Aeroplanes, so there's a plane a bit like this that travels between the mainland, there's a helicopter. These are remarkable. Planes can arrive at their destination with a swarm in, and these are obvious places, but there are less obvious places underneath aeroplanes where swarms can hide. These are containers. This is underneath the shipping container. These are the sides of shipping containers. They can slip in, they turn up. The National Bee Unit has sentinel hives quite close to big ports like Felixstowe and so on for that reason, and they can get into cars. And yeah, this looks dramatic, but again, within a very short time, that swarm can be up in the engine compartment or under the car and not be easy to see. And those are the pests and pathogens associated with beekeeping, which are relatively easy to control. The yellow-legged Asian hornet isn't really a pest of beekeeping. It's a general thing. It likes eating honeybees because there's lots of them, but it can survive on other things, and it certainly doesn't need bees or beekeepers to move around. So yellow-legged Asian hornet queens can rest in crevices anywhere. So travellers' baggage, bags, tents, camping equipment. There's lots of people bring their stuff onto the Scilly Isles to camp. So all visitors need to be aware of this possibility and to inspect their baggage. And there's a need to raise awareness. So last September, I was invited across to, this was a Small is Beautiful gathering. So these are farmers, and this bit was talking about farming practices and so on. But as it happens, many of the beekeepers are also farmers, because on an island, people have lots of different jobs. And the rest of the session, I took the opportunity to visit St Agnes, where I hadn't got to. We talked about bee health and pollinators, and Meg, who is a vet, who's a beekeeper, talked about Asian hornets. And then Gilly and I went to the St Mary's Port Users Consultative Committee. So here there were people from the RNLI, the Port Authority, the cruise ship company, the boatmen who go between the islands and so on. And I didn't know what kind of reception we'd get. They probably thought we were mad, but they were really interested. They really took it seriously. And this is the Solonian, which is the ferry, which is now on its last gasp, but about to be replaced by a new one that's on its way. But this is going backwards and forwards. There's a cargo ship going backwards and forwards. There are many other pathways. And so I came back from Scilly. on the Thursday, and then I went straight to Copenhagen to the Apenmondia Congress, and then Gilly sent me this picture, which is an Asian hornet on a protea flower in Tresco Abbey Gardens. The head gardener, Andrew, who is the beekeeper, immediately spotted it, and the National Bee Unit were alerted. Yeah, so it made the headlines. And the National Bee Unit were incredibly supportive. And this is Megan Seymour, the regional bee inspector, and Dan. They all turned up. The nest was found very quickly, destroyed very quickly. But of course, you don't know whether it's released any offspring. So currently where we are, spring hornet trapping program is underway as we speak. Hopefully there were no hornets, queens released before that nest was destroyed, but we don't know. So more DNA and RNA sampling. So the DNA's been done, but we're going to have to redo the RNA. And as I say, the bee inspector is to visit. So it's very much sort of work in progress, but you know, it's so much easier to try and cover everything on a small island than you can do for the whole of the UK. But the principles that remain here are exactly the same, whether you're talking about, you know, the Scilly Isles, Colonsay, Balearic Islands, or anywhere else. These are the kind of things we have to think about in order to preserve biosecurity. So I shall stop there.